This episode of Brains on Games is about building the best town. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and this episode we're going to talk about a town building game that was sent to me not too long ago by the folks over at AEG, Alderac Entertainment Group. And this is a game called Tiny Towns that comes in a great big box. So hopefully you'll be able to see the whole thing, but if not, I'll put up a graphic for you. But Tiny Towns is a game that you can play with between 1 and 6 players. Games take about 45 minutes, maybe a bit longer, depending on the player count. And the box says you can play this game with kids age 14 and up, but I think it's straightforward enough that much younger kids would be able to get the gist here, understand the rules, but maybe they'll need some practice before they develop the best strategies. Let's take a deeper look at Tiny Towns. Tiny Towns is a light to medium weight strategy game. What you're trying to do here is build the town that's going to earn you the most victory points. The game is going to end when no one can place any more buildings or resources on their little 4x4 board, but the buildings interact in a number of different ways to earn you lots of different kinds of points. You're going to be placing resources on your board every turn, and you're going to use those resources to build some buildings. What I think is neat about this game that adds to the replayability is that almost all of the building types are randomized at the start of the game, so you're not going to know what you're going to get. There are, I think, 8 different types of buildings, and 7 of them are going to be dealt out from a deck of cards. The only one that's standard is the cottage. You need to have cottages in your tiny town, and so what you'll see is a cottage is laid out right at the beginning, and then you've got these smaller decks of cards, 4 cards each in the base game, that are going to be dealt out to show what other buildings you can build in your town. I've laid out all the different building types here on the table, and what you may be able to see, I'm not sure how well you can see it here on the screen, but there are these color-coded patterns on each of the cards. That tells you how you're going to build that building, and then underneath that is what kinds of points or abilities that building is going to give you. You may not be able to see all 7 of them here, but there is an 8th building type, and those are dealt out randomly at the start of the game. So what happens is each player is going to have 2 of these, and they'll have one little monument tower. These are the monuments that you can build. You'll have one of these little towers, so you can only build one of them on your board. They're slightly more complicated buildings, maybe. They might require some more resources, but they give you some big bonuses potentially when you get to the end of the game. These are kept secret until you build them. So only one player can build one of these things. Everybody's going to have a different one. There's quite a thick deck, which adds to some variability to the game, but they're kept secret. So you've got a secret mission or a secret goal and sort of asymmetric abilities here when we're talking about just building that one monument that's going to earn you a bunch of victory points, hopefully at the end of the game. There are various decks of these different kinds of buildings, so they've got different card backs, and they show the shape of the building on each one, so that it's easy to sort those out. So those are, like I said, randomized at the start of the game. The black ones are my favorite. They allow you to store some sort of a resource. They might cost you a penalty at the end of the game, but in the game that we played, we were lucky enough to draw the factory at the start, and the factory allows you to put a little resource cube on here, and that resource will be wild for the rest of the game. You can change it if someone places that same resource on your board. Now, I like this little black building because it's built in a way where you can stack the resource cubes on it, so it makes it very easy for all the players to see what this building is trying to do. So I really thought that was a neat little design touch where it's super easy to just stack up to 3 resources on here, or even more really, because you can build a little pyramid if you wanted to and have your own little dexterity game on your board. The random buildings, like I said earlier, adds to the replayability of the game. There's tons of combinations that you might be able to come up with. What you're doing here, though, on your turn, each player, well, the player whose turn it is going to have this little hammer that shows that they're the master builder who's going to be naming a resource. So the master builder will name one of these resources. There's wheat and glass and stone and brick and wood. I'm glad I remembered all of those. And you just name a resource, and each player will place a resource of that type somewhere on their board. There is no downtime other than the time you spend thinking about which resource you want to use and where you want to put it, because everybody is following that lead builder's, the master builder's action. So if I said brick, everyone would take one of these little red cubes and they would put it somewhere on their player board. They're trying to place it in a way that matches these patterns on the building cards, because if you're able to do that, let me put a few extra pieces on here. If you're able to place these resources in a way that matches the pattern on one of the cards, you can then construct the building. So in this case, we've got a tavern over here with 2 bricks in a row and 1 glass, and you could build it either way, or it could be vertical. So it doesn't matter as long as the pattern matches. You can flip it around sideways or upside down. But now I can take one of these green buildings. I should mention that these big wooden containers do not come with the game. I just thought it would be easier for me to organize things so that I didn't just have a big pile of cubes all over the place. But now that I've got those 3 resources, I can take a tavern and place it anywhere. I take these cubes off, but I place the tavern in any of the squares on the grid where I'm removing one of those resources from. Maybe at the start of the game, you want to put things on the edges so that you can leave a big space open in the center where you have more flexibility. You can see some of these buildings require you to organize your resources on a right angle. Some of the buildings require more resources. And depending on where you place them, you're going to earn different points. And that's where the combinations come in. So if you've got a theater, for example, let me grab the theater. If you've got a theater, that's going to give you some bonus points based on the different buildings that are in the same row in the same column in your little town. So on your turn, the master builder is naming a resource. Everyone is placing it on their grid, and then you might be constructing a building if you've got a pattern that you've built that would allow you to do that. There's not very much downtime, but there are some take that actions that you can take. And certainly in a 2-player game, my son found it super easy. He could look at my board and figure out what it was I was trying to build, and the resource he would name would be something that would be useless to me. And then he would find a place to put it on his board in order to build something, and he wound up winning the game. The game is going to continue until no one can place anything on their board anymore. So once your board fills up with resources and buildings, then you're out of the game until everybody else fills up their board. So that's where the downtime might come in if you finish before everyone else does. But we found that people were kind of finishing at the same time in the games that we played, but we were only playing at a 2-player count. So there is a little bit of player elimination. You might have a little bit of wait time, but you could count up your points while you're doing that. And then that's what you do. You count up your points. So your points are going to be based on the buildings and their placements, and everything here, everything is explained at the bottom of these cards. You lose points for spots that are empty if you just have a resource there and you haven't built a building. So you can wind up, as your grid gets more crowded, you can wind up being trapped. So that's where the take that comes in. You might force someone to put some resources on their board that they don't really want. Sometimes the black buildings will allow you to store a resource so that you don't have to block a space on your board. But even those ones, I think it's the warehouse, even those ones will cause you to lose victory points at the end of the game. You've got a score sheet. I'll pull it out from under these cards. You've got a score sheet to use at the end of the game that does make everything easy to calculate. So you would just, each building, you would put the total points that you're earning from each of those buildings and then add them up at the bottom. So it's great for a parent who's kind of helping their kids to count up their points. Everything's being done in an organized way rather than at random. You're going to wind up as you play through the game with boards that look something like this, and I do quite like these pieces. Now, they're all very different shapes, and the cards show exactly which building is which. They're color-coded, but if you're colorblind, they look different enough from one another that you would really be able to tell which is which. The cubes, less so. The cubes all look the same. They're just different colors, but there's no green cubes. There's blue and yellow. There's gray and red and brown. So hopefully even the colorblind players will be able to distinguish one from the other, and the buildings certainly are easy to tell one from the other. This is a chapel in the game that we played. I think the chapel card, a temple here, is the one that popped out in the cards that I drew. Now, I really like the look of these buildings, and like I said, the fact that this black one allows you to stack some cubes on it makes it fun as well. But they are wooden sculpted buildings and wooden cubes, and that's the question I have for you this episode. Are you a player who prefers to play with these kinds of wooden carved pieces that are sort of abstract, or would you rather play with more sculpted buildings, say like the ones in a game like Tapestry, where you have those beautiful fancy painted miniature buildings that you're placing on your city map? So you can leave the answer to that question in the comment section below the video. I'd love to hear what you think about wooden buildings versus plastic or resin ones. What skills are players exercising when they're playing a game like Tiny Towns? Well, right away, what should probably jump out at you is that this is a game that's all about spatial problem solving and spatial planning. You have to be careful where you place your resources and where you place your buildings. You're trying to plan ahead to make sure you have enough space to get the buildings that you want. Of course, it's a strategy game, so you're exercising those executive functioning skills that involve planning and organization and budgeting. But really, I wanted to talk about this game, especially because it's so spatial. And one of the major spatial skills that you're using, not only are you kind of planning ahead the layout of your tiny town, but you're also exercising mental rotation skills, because you're looking at the arrangement of the resources that are going to make these buildings, but they're not always on your board going to be aligned horizontally in the same way. They might be vertical, they might be flipped around all the way so that they're 180 degrees from what it is that you're looking at here. So you're exercising spatial problem solving and spatial planning, but mental rotation skills is an aspect of what you're doing here as well. There's a pattern recognition element. Pattern recognition is a super important skill. We measure that when we're doing IQ tests, and you're trying to create these patterns. You're building these patterns on the board, and you're trying to match them with the ones on the card so that you can get the building that you want. There is a working memory element to this as well. Working memory, of course, is one of the executive functioning skills, and working memory is like the whiteboard in your mind where you hold information so you can manipulate it somehow. And there's so many different ways of organizing these little wooden cubes on your board that you're really juggling. Okay, if I put this here, I could make this building, but if I don't create the building yet, I might have space to make this other one just in case the other player takes this resource. So there's enough information to juggle. Now, like I said earlier, this is a game that it says on the box for 14 and up, and I think teenagers are certainly going to be the ones who are most skilled at taking advantage of those take that kinds of actions where you're placing a resource that's not useful to the other players, or to remember all the interactions between all of these cards. But the game is so simple. You've got those 7 different buildings plus the monuments. You don't even have to play with the monuments if you want to simplify things a little bit. And then you're just filling up this 16 space grid. So I think that it is one of those games where the working memory aspect is there, but it's not necessarily the main thing that you're going to be juggling. Now, I say that because working memory is a skill that tends to continue to develop into, well, later on in life. It's those executive functions that include working memory. Those parts of the brain aren't really wired up until you're in your mid to late 20s even, is what the brain research is showing. So younger kids aren't going to have great skills when it comes to working memory, but you can tailor this game a little bit. Maybe instead of randomly assigning the buildings that you're going to use, you can choose them on purpose to make the game more straightforward and a little bit easier for those younger or less experienced players. Final thoughts about Tiny Towns. Now, I know I'm late to the game on this one. This is a game that came out quite some time ago. There are some expansions for it now even, which I think is great. This is a game with lots of replayability because of all those different building cards, and the expansions would add even more options. I haven't even tried those ones out. But you've got lots of replayability here, and you've got these great components. I love the buildings in Tapestry, but these buildings are great too, and especially that black one that I showed you earlier. That's my favorite one, just being able to stack up those little pieces. So you've got great components. You've got a game that is straightforward in terms of being able to learn the rules and understand how to play. But the interactions between the different buildings and the way that you organize things on your board, I mean, it's still strategic. So it's easy to learn and easy to teach and fairly quick to play, but there are lots of strategic options there and enough variability to keep people coming back to the table. It is one that I wanted to play right away after we were done, but try and convince my son to play the same game, 2 times in a row. It's not always the easiest thing to do. Depends on what his friends are doing sometimes. I like the fact that you've got those follow actions where one person is naming a resource, but then everybody's placing it. So you're not waiting for a person to do 5 things before you get to your turn. You're not going all the way around the table before you can do anything. Everybody's doing everything on every single turn. There's one turn where they're going to get the choice, and maybe some younger kids might be impatient to be the ones who get to choose the resource, but you're always doing something on other players' turns as well. If there's a downside to a game like Tiny Towns, and I really don't think that there is a downside to this game, I really liked it, but if there is a downside, I would say it's that it's a game that would play best, I think, at lower player counts. So it does play with up to 6 players. I think with 2 or 3, this game is going to be the best, especially with 3, because with 3 players, you can't sort of only focus on the other player's board and concentrate on doing those take that actions like my son wanted to do. With 3 players, you've got a little bit more options, but you can still be strategic. Now, when there are 6 people calling out those resources, it's a little harder to plan ahead because you don't know what things you're going to be putting on your board at any given time. So I think it's a game that's going to play at the very best with 3. It plays very well with 2 also, but as you get to the higher numbers, it might be a bit more challenging. It's also a game where, other than calling out the resources that the players don't want, you're building your own thing. It's that tableau building element. You're building your own tableau. I'm not reaching across and destroying the other player's buildings or anything like that, or putting things on their board to interfere with what they're doing. So the player interaction is there in terms of those take that actions, but it's sort of limited. And for some players really like to be more interactive and to play on the other player's boards as well. But this is a game that I really enjoyed. It's a game that I'm really looking forward to playing with my nieces and nephews because I think it's strategic enough, but simple enough at the same time. There's not too much reading. The symbols are very clear. The pieces are fantastic, and it's a tactile experience too. So Tiny Towns is a winner for me, and that is Tiny Towns in a nutshell. Thanks so much to AEG for sending this game my way. As I said before, you can answer the question in the comment section below the video, but if you have any questions or comments, you can also leave them in the comment section, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and the previous ones are up there already. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.